Hi. I realise I've actually just left my speech at the back. Right, I think I know what I'm going to say, so I might rush up in a bit. But so first off, hi, it's lovely to see you all. And I was just listening to the tail end of that, and it sounds like you're all having a very interesting conversation. So I did, for a long time, I've been working on the history of Britain and its empire, more often about the history of empire. And I wrote a largish book about trying to summarise, and it was from that Ella Whelan said, you need to write us a pamphlet, and we talked about different things we might do it on, but then it became clear from the conversation that the one issue that people were really talking about was reparations for slavery. Now, I've got to say that, well, to introduce it, I mean, I'm assuming you know quite a lot because, you know, it's the 21st century, you're young and intelligent. Britain's role in the slave trade is unassailably wicked and awful. I think that's straightforward to me. You can talk as much as you like about slavery in ancient Rome or Greece or you know, the Barbary slave trade. It's phenomenally different. It's quantitatively different. So I know there are people that like to minimise that and talk about these other contrasts, but to me that seems like, first off, silly, you know, and just bad history because you know, numbers count. And the numbers are phenomenal about the number of people that were transported in the European transatlantic slave trade and the role that Britain played within that slave trade. Just, there's no point in minimising that. The question really is a moral question, as it were, and also one about how we understand history right now. It's a moral question in should we do something to repair the damage? That's what it means, reparation. And also, how do we understand it? And I want to make my two main points are these. And I suppose I'm conscious that it sounds a bit like I'm trying to make a provocative argument to get a provocative response, but I don't believe that's what I'm trying to do. So the first thing I'd like to say is this, is that because it's history, you're studying, we're, as it were, talking about history in the context of this moral discussion about the present, is that the best way to understand history is it doesn't exist. That's the short definition of what is the past. History is the study of the past. The past is what no longer exists. If you were discussing something that did exist, like, let's say, the monarchy, you could do the history of the monarchy, but it's still there, so you'd be doing political science if you're talking about the monarchy because it's still here. So if history is a study of things which do not exist anymore, and I want to say, I know there are exceptions, and there are you know, some unhappy chapters in the world and even in British society, but slavery doesn't exist. You know, the slavery that we're talking about, it just doesn't exist. It's happened. It was a terrible thing. It happened, but it doesn't exist anymore. I think that's the first thing I want to say. And the second thing I want to say is that, which is a bit more complicated, is about reparation. The act of reparation never satisfies the people who it's meant to satisfy. Invariably, nobody is ever satisfied with an act of reparation. And I want to explain why that must be the case. So let me just stick with the first point for a bit. And as it were, this is, I know it's not, you might say it's not really true to say the past doesn't exist anymore, because loads of things in the past that happened in the past exist for us now. You know, like the Enlightenment or the music of Bach, or, you know, all those things happened all that time ago, and now they're here, still with us, aren't they? You can still listen to it, you can play the music and all the rest of it. But that's because we recreate it in the present. You know, that's the beauty of music. I'm sure you discussed this. You can pick up those notes on the page and you can recreate that moment in the here and now. That's in itself is extraordinary. But we have a choice. When we recreate things, you choose to do that. Yeah, and with the question of slavery, we're choosing to reflect upon slavery in the contemporary moment because it's important to us now. It's important to people right now to think about that, and that's why they do. The reasons why it might be important are complicated. It's necessary. I think it's a good thing that historians reflect on all these terrible chapters in human history. We should reflect on the good chapters, but we should reflect on the terrible chapters. Those of people who work in history, they should be doing that. That's their work. You know, that's their working lives. That's what they should be doing. Students who are at school and university, they should spend some time looking at, slavery, as they should spend some time looking at the Second World War or the kings and queens of England or all those other things. It's important to know your past insofar as you're in the history lesson. I don't want to overload that because people go a bit mad about this and they say, oh, you must study history. And they say, oh, nobody ever taught me about the slave trade. And I always think, what happened? Were you nicking off? Because I've learned about it a lot. I've got 2 daughters who have just gone through North London community schools, poshish ones, I've got to admit. But and they did a lot of slavery and colonialism and all of that. And I was kind of interested because that's the thing I'm interested in. But they told me lots. So I think you had to be not paying attention if you didn't learn anything about slavery after going to school in England any time between about 1980 or even earlier, in me and Mo's case. We did discuss slavery was a couple of lessons in the GCSE curriculum all those years ago, or when it was O-level, whatever. And it's still taught a certain amount, it's quite a lot of discussion of slavery within British schools with Black History Week and all the rest of it. So it's there, we're talking about it. So this is the other question is, what are we doing when we're talking about it? So what is the history? What is the lesson? And I think that your attitude to the past, you can have 2 attitudes. One I'm going to suggest is wrong, and one I think is about right. And the one is that the past is this thing that overweighs us and makes us who we are. I think that's quite a strong view, by the way. It's like every Hollywood psychodrama. The troubled heroine or hero is, confronted with all kinds of difficulties, and then they discover the terrible thing that happened in their past, with some evil aunt or what have you that did experiments on them in the cellar or something like that. And then they understand the flaw in their character, and all is revealed. And it's a compelling story because the idea is that if you could just undo the key of the past, if you could find the thing that happened in your past, you could fix your life today. And we think of history a bit like that. There's the way that we've talked if you were to go back about 20 years, we would be talking about the Holocaust in these terms. But today, more often we talk about slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, or the British Empire in the terms as that terrible thing, that touchstone of wickedness, that if we just put that in perspective, we'll understand how we got to where we are. And that's a compelling view because it's saying that we're made by this event. This event overwhelms us. It overwhelms the people who are the descendants of the victims of slavery in particular. But all of us, the idea is that all of us are shaped by these things that happened between about 1620 and 1832, the transatlantic slave trade, when Britain was a participant in it. And you get lots of evidence of that. You can see all the country houses that were built with funds from the slave trade. You can see the the docks, the West India docks that were financed through the slave trade, and people will tell you, look, you know, our indebtedness to the slave trade, the way it dominates us. And also you can say, we look at the lives that people live today. You know, if you look at the lives that people live and you go and visit the communities who are the descendants of people who were enslaved in the West Indies and then migrated to Britain, and you can say, look at the damage that was done. And you can look at things like educational attainment and income, and you would say, yes, the injury that was done by the slave trade, by the enslavement of this person's ancestors, so overwhelming that it's passed through the generations and thwarted them in the present. I don't believe that's true. I want to say that. And I'm very happy if anyone wants to argue the other way, because I'm aware that I'm not doing my job as a teacher if I say what I think is the truth. I've got to say, you know, this is what I think, you know, and you can argue with me. But I think it's much more the case that what happens is that we make an attitude towards the past, pretty much depending upon our circumstances in the present. We recreate the injury. So my mother, who was a very eccentric woman, used to take us to country houses in a spirit of hatred, of class hatred, and she would deliberately go on a Sunday and provoke the lord of the manor to get up and show us around, even though it was out of hours. And she'd say, look, it says so in my National Trust handbook. She was a very strange person, lovely. And to her, it was all about the wickedness of the oppressors of the English. She was entirely indifferent to, you know, where the slave money done that. It wasn't part of her story. I didn't even know this. So I knew all this story, but I didn't know that punchline was that it all came from, it didn't actually all come from the West Indies, but some of the money that paid for that came from the West Indies. But see, the point of this is that your attitude, the story you're telling in the present really depends on about how you, about the past, depends on how you feel about the present. If you feel thwarted, and if you feel that you're missing out, that you've been frustrated in some way, that there are barriers in your life, it's much easier to dwell upon the injury of the past, and the injury of the past becomes much more determinant. It becomes a way to understand your own predicament, you know. And I often think about this as, you know, why do white people go to see films about slavery? You know, what are they getting out of that? And I think it's complicated, you know. It never used to be, but now Hollywood makes films all the time. You know, I was sat in the cinema watching Mr. Northrop being whipped, and I'm thinking, what am I getting out of this exactly? What's the payoff for me? And I think it's complicated, but I think in part there's a degree of identification. You know, people like the stories of slavery because they feel put upon and oppressed, and they read their lives through the lives of people who are enslaved. And they also feel that they enjoy slave revolts, as we all do. You know, it's a great moment in the cinema when the slaves throw off the chains. And, you know, read your Bible. That's a lot of what it's about. So I think that's really important, is that it's a story of freedom which speaks to a lot of people. So I don't think it's trivial, but it's important to understand what we're doing when we talk about slavery. We are talking about the past, but we're also talking about our own circumstances. And the extent to which you feel overweighed by the past, I think, is a problem. You know, if you feel that the past is a thing which is determining your situation in the present, that's a debilitating thing. That's robbing you of your ability to control and make and determine your situation in the present. Then I'm going on a bit, but I want to turn to the second part, which is this, is that, so I've talked like in general terms, I hope with some illustration, but in the actual history of reparations, I mean, not just in the history of slavery, but in the history of reparations, many people who say we need to make reparation for slavery will dwell upon the one shocking example which really does seem to make the case, which you may know, you may have read this, is that when the British did abolish slavery in 1832, what the Parliament decided was to compensate the slave owners. Now, understandably, many people in the West Indies and people of West Indian descent will look at this and say, the hell? I mean, are you joking? Is this literally what happened? And yeah, this is actually what happened. They paid the slave owners for the loss of their property. And you think, oh, OMG, what is going on? And it is astonishing. But I want to say that's very in keeping with reparations. That's what reparations are like. What I discovered when I was doing the research on the empire was that it wasn't the only act of reparation. They kept making acts of reparation. This is a weird thing. So Lord Palmerston, he said, I want to make reparations for the slave enslavement of Africans. And what he did was he made what was called an African squadron of ships of the Royal Navy to police the seas, the Atlantic, and at the West African coast to stop slavery. And it motivated the expense of this by saying, and we must do this because these are his words, we owe a debt of reparation to the people of Africa. We owe a debt of reparation to the people of Africa. Well, you've got it there in black and white. You could make the case and just say, there you go, we do. Except you'd have to concede that he felt that he'd made the act of reparation, not in 1832, but in 1846 when he financed the Africa Squadron. Did it help people of colour? It's a knife edge because obviously there are people who were set free by the Africa Squadron. But they also invaded various parts of West Africa and what's modern-day Nigeria, and made war against the Ashanti and sacked towns and burnt Benin, all in the name of fighting slavery. So you could equally say, well, I'm not so sure it was such a great thing. Now, I need to cut this story a bit shorter. So there are many examples when they set out to colonize Africa. They did so on the idea that they were going to abolish slavery. They ended up kind of enslaving the whole continent. But the idea was we're going to abolish Arab slavery. So, and you think, well, this is, it's a bit like sort of Dracula, you never kind of kill him. You keep driving the stake through his heartbeat, pops up every time. And you think, well, why do we keep having to make reparation for the act of slavery? I think it's in the concept of reparation itself. Reparations itself is a weird concept. It means to fix the harm done, but to get back to where we were, to make repair, to repair the circumstance. It's to restore order. So we'll concede fault as much as we need to get back to where we were. But the trouble is that where we were usually contains all the same problems in the place, in the first place. So when they talked about reparations in the Houses of Parliament, they had another concept in mind that they were seeking to forestall. They said, we want to make reparation. We don't want expropriation. What they meant was we didn't want the abolition of slavery without compensation, because that would be a concession to levellers and Jacobins. They would say, you can't abolish private property. That's absurd. And they said, but we've got this problem. You can't have property in a person. That was what the moralists were saying. They said, well, we all did this together. England, we all did this together. So we'll compensate the slave owners for the loss of the slaves as property and set the slaves free thereby. And no, of course, it's frustrating, it's humiliating to think that they were compensated. But it will always be frustrating and it will always be humiliating, because the act of reparation is, in a sense, a Lady Bountiful doing right by you, graciously giving, making apology or reparation. And your circumstances remain problematic, robbed, thwarted all the time. my last point, I suppose, in the middle of this, is that I was always surprised when this issue reoccurred. You know, Hilary Beckles wrote a great book, a good book, making the case for reparations. And I thought, well, I thought this was done and dusted, because I can very strongly remember some time ago, they're both dead now, but a broadcaster, both West Indian, Darcus Howe, argued with Bernie Grant, who was my boss when he was head of the Haringey Council, and then he was the MP. And they were at daggers drawn because Bernie Grant, the Member of Parliament, said we must have reparations for slavery. It must be the issue. And Darcus Howe was appalled. He said, "Are you mad?" He said, "What, I should go cap in hand asking for reparations? What kind of idiot what kind of demeaning posture would that be, to say, please, please reward me, you know, fix the wrong that was done to me." And Darcus Howe, who was the militant in this relationship, his instincts were reactive. I hate that idea. What, I should do that? And that was the as it were, the radical third world nationalist position. Don't ask for help. Don't ask for compensation, because it's demeaning and it perpetuates the position of subordination that the original act of enslavement did. Oh,